So look what I have here. This is a book by Laszlo Bock. It talks about a number of experiments and research that was done by the Google team to evaluate and improve their hiring practices. There's so many good nuggets here. One of them is that job interviews are not that good at predicting how someone performs once they're hired. So what is the best predictor then? Work sample. The problem is actually asking someone to perform work is not that feasible. So teams tend to go with one of three types: a portfolio presentation, a whiteboard exercise, or a take-home task. As the other two videos, we'll get to hear from our guests, Thomas and Lawton, who did a whole presentation on this topic, and it's their work that was the inspiration for this trilogy of videos.
Once we get to the later stages, one of the defining characteristics is that you're going to likely see some form of work sample test. And in UX research specifically, we tend to see three. The most common of those is a portfolio review, so that the candidate presents actual work that they've done in the past, some case studies that they might have built. And this is often split into two phases. One where they actually present the work, and then a lot of Q&A afterwards.
A presentation is really your chance to show how you've conducted UX research in the past with one or two different projects. And the team will ask questions and try to understand how you dealt with any challenges or anything unexpected.
There's not as much pressure for researchers to have a public website or portfolio. The stuff that we do is so tightly bound by confidentiality agreements and NDAs. We don't recommend, wasting a lot of time trying to do that. Instead, just kind of repurpose deliverable materials that you already have.
Oh yes, this is good advice. It's a way to be pragmatic about the amount of work and time you're spending on a portfolio. Portfolio for UX researchers can be a PDF document or a slide deck, not a website like what we see with UX designers. Nothing against setting up a website, but just keep in mind the amount of effort you're putting into it. What is worth the effort, if you're currently employed or working on a UX research project, is to keep track of the project you're working on, describing what you're going through. Nowadays, I use this little journal to write down any of the hurdles, decisions, and it will help me when preparing for job interviews or when going over a case study.
The idea is really to have kind of a bank instead of, a locked portfolio that just has 2 or 3 standard case studies in it. Whenever you have a project where something interesting happened or you faced a challenge that might be good to speak to, go ahead, sanitize, archive that, and then when the time comes to apply, you can pick and choose and say, these are the ones that are most relevant to this particular job.
You may have heard this before, the need to protect confidentiality agreement when sharing a case study. It just means being careful with what you share, removing any sensitive data, no specific details that companies wouldn't want shared. At the same time, you don't want to go overboard and strip out so much that you lose context. My advice is for you to find time to rehearse and present your case study to someone. You can even ask UX mentors to help. There are platforms out there, and I have a video on this topic, so check it out. I suggest you rehearse and present it to someone for 2 reasons. One, the person may ask questions you haven't thought of. The other reason is to make sure you understand how long you're taking when presenting the portfolio. A very common issue, and I've seen this myself, candidates not giving themselves enough time to allow for questions at the end. What questions? As an example, what happened after you shared the insights? It's a classic, right? We focus so much on the what. Sometimes the so what is less evident, what that led to. Of course, throughout your case study, be prepared to answer the why question. When it comes to portfolio presentation, these are the main points to keep in mind. Make sure you give enough context for your role and the project. See if you can highlight the points that you've noticed the hiring team cares about. Explain the why behind your choices. Remember to spend some time with outcomes and impact, preferably something quantifiable, numbers. And last but not least, keep track of the time, manage the presentation of the portfolio to allow time for the questions at the end. Now, we went into a lot of detail on the portfolio presentation, but I think it's fair to point out a potential downside to portfolios.
From the hiring side, the disadvantage is, it doesn't have that clean comparability that take-home test does, or a take-home test does. The biggest thing that we saw was that we aren't providing candidates with the structure and guidance that they need to really give an effective portfolio presentation.
So you may not be comparing apples to apples here. People that have good or interesting projects in their past tend to do better than those that were unlucky or didn't manage to get meaty projects. Because of this, some companies consider other ways to evaluate the candidate. This is where you get to hear more about whiteboard exercise and the take-home task.
There's a whiteboarding exercise. And what we do there is present the candidate with a scenario. Oftentimes, we might say something like, imagine that our data analytics team noticed this issue. Come up with a research study that would gather answer as to what's going on and how to fix it. And the candidate might have some time to come up with a rough plan, start to jot it out, but they do it live. That's the main characteristic there.
The whiteboard exercise is an interesting one. In practice, it feels like you can get a baseline for everyone who applies for the job. It's easy to compare one to the other, and it doesn't require as much time as a take-home task.
The whiteboard exercise is a nice option just because there's not nearly as much time involved. The problem is it's not going to give you as complete a picture of that candidate. The scope is usually quite limited. So it might be like, hey, let's design a study that would meet these sorts of goals. Well, that's just really one part of the job, right? And since it is sort of on the spot and timed, it can be really stress inducing. You're kind of assessing how well they respond to like this weird artificial job interview environment and not necessarily the skills you're ultimately interested in.
That's a problem I had as well. The stressful bit of having to come up with a research plan in 10, 20 minutes doesn't match how things are done in real life. A whiteboard exercise puts the pressure to rush through one path, one approach. So it could easily put reflective, methodical researchers at a disadvantage.
A lot of our techniques are really repurposed from other fields, and the whiteboard exercise is really a offshoot of the way that a lot of software developers and software engineers do their interviews.
Yeah, whiteboard exercises can be very popular when hiring for engineers, but for researchers, we're so involved in collaboration and working with others. Depending on the way it's set up, it can actually work against the researcher. The whiteboard exercise can work if the interviewer allows some back and forth, because at least you're evaluating collaboration skills. So the interviewer can see what's the critical thinking there, how does the person formulate questions. What about the third option, take-home tasks?
Where the whiteboard is done on the spot, the take-home test is done on the candidate's own time. So they might receive a prompt to do some specific type of research and run that study, and oftentimes also present it.
So the take-home task can be seen as the one that is the closest to actually getting a work sample, and you have all candidates working from the same prompt. Nice. But there is a problem.
One thing we found was that they're very widely disliked. I was actually surprised by how negatively they were perceived by job seekers. The problem is the time that candidates spend on those is not transferable from one job to the next. They're going to spend however many hours, and if they don't move forward with you, that time is totally lost.
So there's this major problem with take-home tasks. They're not very inclusive. Think about it. These tasks take a big chunk of free time to complete, so they put certain job seekers at an unfair disadvantage. People with families, imagine you're a single parent working full-time, or you have caregiving responsibilities. For these applicants, finding enough free time to spend on a take-home task can be difficult. Today, you may face one of these 3 types of work sample tasks, but the most common one, at least in the US, is the portfolio presentation.
The portfolio presentation, since it is preferred by candidates and it does have this potential to be a highly structured exercise, I think it is the clear winner. And like I said, that's something that I was kind of convinced of through this research. As someone who's used take-home tests in the past, I was like, yeah, this has advantages. We can actually achieve all of the same sort of goals as long as we give it some structure and do this in a thoughtful way.
But I would say this moment that we have at the end of the hiring process is not supposed to be scary or stressful. It's about you describing your process and talking to people that in most cases are interested in what you do.
This is really the part of the interview that you should probably be most excited about, because it is, from a predictive validity perspective, the part that is most highly correlated among the common interview activities that we see with your actual job success.
If you haven't seen it yet, there are 2 other videos on how teams hire UX researchers today. Also important, I only know if these videos are helpful if you let me know. So please comment or like. Your feedback helps me understand what content resonates with you, and I appreciate it. And subscribe if you're interested in more on the topic of UX research. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.